Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Contemplation Conversations series for the event Beyond the Buzzwords, Navigating the Risks and Rewards of Mental Health Apps. It's hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre and the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne. I'm Jon Faine, I'm a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, and it's an absolute honour and a privilege and a steep learning curve to be asked to help with this event. First, we'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to all Indigenous participants. And on a personal note, I'd also like to add that I'm impatient for a treaty or treaties to try and repair just some of the damage of our colonial past in this land we call Australia. And also on a personal note, in order to get to treaty, we need the voice so that we have people with whom to entreat. But that's just a personal gesture on my part. We have a wonderful panel of speakers and I'll introduce them, although that's not the order in which they're going to speak. Professor Ginny Patterson is one of the founding co-directors of the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, an interdisciplinary research, teaching and policy centre at the University of Melbourne. It involves the faculties of engineering, information technology, law, arts, medicine, education and science, in fact, just about the whole university. Jenny's also the co-leader of the Digital Equity Research Stream at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, and her expertise lies in the area of consumer protection, consumer credit and data protection law, as well as the law of emerging digital technologies, AI and robotics. And as anyone who consumes the daily mainstream media knows, this is an area at the moment of absolute urgency. Associate Professor Nicholas Van Dam is the inaugural Director of Contemplative Studies Centre here at the University of Melbourne. His research program includes exploration of the ways that meditation and mindfulness practices can support well-being, and he has an extensive academic expertise in contemplative practice with an interest and understanding of the complex ethical, social and systemic issues associated with the hype, hope and reality of meditation and mindfulness research and practice. And that's beautifully done, hype, hope and reality. And our third but first in time speaker is Kelly Clark. Kelly's a SANE Peer Ambassador and Lived Experience Integration Lead at the University of Western Australia. I'm sure she'll explain what SANE, the acronym, stands for. She's a Warramayan Wapella Wadjala woman who lives and grew up on Wajak Noongar Budja, which I hope, Kelly, please forgive me if my pronunciation is suboptimal, is the right way to describe it in Western Australia. And she joins us from the West. She has a keen interest in promoting human flourishing and promoting actions which treat people like people. Her background is in philosophy and theology. Her research passion is bringing a lived experience expertise into all aspects of service and system design, delivery and evaluation. Nothing about us without us is the phrase that we use again and again and again. So we're delighted to open with you, Kelly, if you could please. And could you share with us, and generously if you can, your personal experience of being harmed by a meditation app? Tell us what happened.
Thanks. I want to start by saying in my ancestors' language, Yalawira and Wajak Noongar Budja, Yalawira and Wakamalumumun by Bire. I sit on Wajak Noongar country, on West Coast country. I'm really honoured to have been welcomed so generously by the Wajak Noongar elders, who invite all of us in a process of Danju Kulin, walking together for this place here towards 2029 and beyond. 29 will be 200 years since the founding of the Swan River colony. I'm really happy to be here today. Jurapin Court, my heart is happy because this is such an important conversation to think about the harms, the various types of harms that well-meaning people and products can contribute to, but also that unthinking people and products perhaps even more directly contribute to. It's part of lived experience ethics that I'm not going to be talking about particular apps. I won't name any particular app, but I will talk broadly about, about the real harms that I've experienced by being given meditation apps and so-called mindfulness apps and programs to do that haven't looked at my whole self, but also haven't even just looked clinically at what would be helpful for me. I've been in therapy since I was 10. I'm now 31, but I was first admitted when I was 21, so 10 years ago, to a mental health ward, and it saved my life. Part of the on-ward program was kind of a dialectical behavior therapy light. And a key part of dialectical behavior therapy is mindfulness in the sense used by mental health treatment professionals, not in the sense used by Buddhist practitioners. Mindfulness in the sense of being aware of what's going on around you and within you is a skill that is present in a lot of wisdom traditions. There are examples all across Australia from the cultures that have been here since time immemorial. And in Noongar country, one of the related terms is da ni, which translates something like deep listening or meditation or contemplation or attentiveness. However, being on ward and then being discharged with recommendations for mindfulness actually put my recovery back significantly. Unsupervised and non-physical meditations just straight out triggered dissociation for me. And my ability to not dissociate was the thing that kept me from self-harm. It was always in dissociative states that I self-harmed in various ways. And it was like we could catch it on ward. The first time that it happened on ward, I got to talk to the psychologist and nurse leading the mindfulness group and say, like, hey, this was weird. Is this what is meant to happen? And so we caught it, so I didn't have to continue doing it on ward, but the standard, here are things that can help you pack that I was given on discharge included some app recommendations. And I wound up back in hospital within less than a month because I was trying really hard to do the right thing. And it, unfortunately, because of our broken system, I didn't end up on the same ward or with the same treatment team. And so they didn't have the history of knowing that mindfulness wouldn't work for me in the way that it's done. And basically told me I wasn't trying hard enough and that I should do more of it. Yep. And so the combination of mindfulness like meditation that is focused on feelings or thoughts and not on being grounded in physical reality as it currently is super, like we know from, I'm not going to pretend at at this point in the week that I can name the research, but there is plenty of research that shows that those kind of meditations are not helpful for people with complex trauma. That unsupervised like meditations or going into past feelings or feelings related to the past is not helpful for people with complex trauma. And there are a number of apps that have been recommended to me, continue to be recommended to my peers, that promote exactly those kinds of things. And we know that it's not helpful, and I directly experienced harm from it.
Kelly, when you reported back to your treating doctors, therapists, whoever they were, what was their response?
On ward, I was really fortunate. The ward that I was on at the time had a service set up. The entire ward was optimized for people with complex trauma and personality disorder, which might be the same thing. And so they understood straight away when I was like, hey, this is what's happening for me. They could recognize immediately that it was a dissociative state. They could explain to me what that was. And they were like, yeah, fine. Like, next week is not the emotional stuff. It's like mindfulness of eating a Malteser or something. And maybe that will be helpful for you. And it wasn't, I didn't dissociate from it, but it just felt not great for me. And so they were fine with me not attending those groups, and were happy to explain to my doctor that, like my on-ward doctor, that me not going was actually helpful for me. But outpatient treatment teams, the treatment team at the other hospital, saw my, no, I don't want to do this. And the fact that I had some words around it, the fact that I could label what happened as dissociation, they saw it as me being tricksy and trying to avoid getting help when like constantly and always, all I've been trying to do is get better. Eventually I got to the point where I found a string of magic words to say that works most of the time. Means that I like don't continue to get pressured to use apps that aren't helpful. Being able to draw on my my religious tradition and on my heritage and just be like, yeah, we have similar practices in these and those are what I use, gets most people off my back. But but those practices are not the same thing as mindfulness as meant by mental health practitioners. They're just really easily conflated.
So sometimes if you go to the doctor and you've got an infection, they'll give you an antibiotic, and if it doesn't work, they'll say, oh, we just need to use a different antibiotic, and we keep trying different ones till we find the one that works, and the pathology results come back and that directs them which way to go. Did anyone say, oh, we're just using the wrong app, we need to get you onto a different app?
Yeah, so that was definitely the case in some of the outpatient settings. And so like I've tried a number of apps. I'm not, I feel like I need to, like from the lived experience practitioner perspective, be like, just because I had difficulty with apps doesn't mean that everyone will. However, like none of those apps worked well for me. The closest thing that worked for me was a compassionate body scan, because again, it's grounded in the reality of what's now, and it puts me back in touch with my body. But that's not so much an app as just a script that I can follow. Yeah, none of the apps that I was recommended were helpful for me.
Do you think
Definitely
it's also, sorry, do go on.
No, go.
We all know, it's of notorious public knowledge, that the public health system, particularly the mental health treatment system, is scandalously short of money. And the temptation for practitioners overwhelmed with demand from people begging for help would be to outsource as much as they can.
Yep.
Do you think that's what's happening with people? They're just like, okay, this can do my job for me while I go and do something else?
There's definitely part of that. And not at all because those practitioners don't care, actually probably precisely because they do care. Rather than just pushing someone off, they're trying desperately to find a way to manage all of their competing priorities. And we all do it. We all recommend things that people have recommended to us, like to people that it won't necessarily help. And because there's only emerging evidence around particular practices, let alone scant evidence around particular apps and their helpfulness for people with like different life experiences, they can't really make informed recommendations often, which like you can recommend like for someone with workplace stress, like some CBT is likely to be helpful if you've ruled out previous things. But maybe for people without complex trauma or other complex conditions, some of those apps might be helpful. But there's not enough support for clinicians, and consequently, there's not enough support for patients.
So I'm not stealing thunder from our next two speakers of Nicholas and Jeannie, but this is the Wild West, isn't it? Is that how you came away thinking, wow, there's no rules, there's no guidelines, there's no limits, there's no structure. They just, it's like handing out pills without any control, except it's handing out apps without any.
Yeah, those apps and programs, especially the ones that aren't just, as I say, that like just audio of like talking through, let's eat a sultana mindfully, or let's be present in our bodies. Yeah, like those are, even then those scripts, like if they're not, there's not necessarily evidence for a bunch of those, and they can be done badly. They can be done badly in person, but at least in person, it's easier to flag like, hey, this isn't working for me.
Sure.
Like as an example of an in-person one, I had an OT group in hospital that I went to where we did the like relaxation from head to toe, kind of relaxing each muscle groups. And she talked about it as the stress moving down our body. And then we didn't release it out of our toes. And so I walked around for 3 days with like my toes feeling like they were super tense and stressed. But I could at least flag that to my nurse, and we could redo that script, but actually then release it out of my toes, and that was okay. But you can't do that with an app.
Can't interact with it. No, I mean, maybe it'll come. I'm sure we'll get there before the session's up. So how are your toes today?
Really good, actually. Yeah, I have a great physio as well as a great treatment team, and just overall, I'm doing so much better than I was 10 years ago.
And you're very generous in sharing all of that with us. We'll come back to you shortly.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Nicholas, is this just the Wild West? Is it full of snake oil salespeople, or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing your story. It does really kind of connect with me and remind me, I guess, of some of what's going on, and particularly the part at the end, I guess, to Jon's question. I think there are a lot of clinicians and providers that are very well intentioned, as you said, and I think that the challenge is the evidence base, and sort of the way that many of these programs are kind of offered. That there often is a strong suggestion of that they're scientifically backed and they're evidence based, and the reality, and there's been studies sort of showing this, that there's very little research on apps, in particular mindfulness apps. And so the challenge, I guess, is that when we say they're evidence-based, what evidence are we drawing on? And I think that the challenge is, so what we're often drawing on is face-to-face, in-person structured programs. So things like mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And these kinds of programs were developed and have been around. MBSR was developed in the 70s, early 80s. MBCT came out in the 2000s. And so there's been hundreds of randomized controlled trials looking at these programs and programs like them. And they're pretty intense. These are 8-week courses led by someone who has pretty extensive, a year or more training. Participants meet weekly with a teacher in a small group for 2 to 3 hours for 8 weeks. And those on average work pretty well. They don't necessarily work better than other treatment approaches, well-being-based treatment approaches. And so that also it can be a bit of a problem. But then the app sort of space is pushing it even further and saying, quote unquote, because mindfulness works and we do mindfulness, what we do works. And so I think where it starts to become the Wild West is there's sort of this extrapolation of mindfulness and meditation are helpful. They lead to brain changes. The mental health crisis is a huge problem. And then there's sort of, with the other hand, holding up, and we have this app that draws on mindfulness. And so and I think, as Kelly alluded to, and what is mindfulness? What do we mean by mindfulness? It's sort of, we've gotten to this point where people can do whatever they want to do and they can claim it's mindfulness. So coloring in is mindfulness, and spot the difference is mindfulness, and gardening is mindfulness. And so all of a sudden now, people are just going, hey, I've got an idea for an app, and it uses mindfulness, and mindfulness has evidence behind it. Therefore, what I do must be evidence-based. And so I think that's a big part of the challenge is all these factors we're talking about, whereby the terms are really loose and they're hard to pin down. There's these claims that things are evidence-based, but what do we mean by that? And then there is, I think, this sort of genuine desire to help people, and there's a genuine shortage of people to provide that help. And so I think, as we heard in Kelly's story, there is a desire to kind of provide people with things they might be able to do on their own, but there is a real lack of regulation and oversight. Nobody is saying you have to demonstrate that this works the way that you're describing it to. No one is saying, I need to see a trial of your particular app before you can make a claim that your app is evidence-based. That's not happening. So what these apps are doing, and online programs as well, is just saying, well, what we do is somewhat similar to what happened in those structured 8-week courses or programs, and therefore we're evidence-based, we're science-backed. And, as far as I can tell, that's far from the case. The reality sort of is what's happening on these apps. It's, as Kelly alluded, you're unsupervised, you're on your own. Oftentimes the kind of guided practices that they contain look nothing like what's in these structured programs. And you just really have no idea what people are doing when they practice them, because you're on your own. The people are sort of sitting at their homes, in their rooms, or wherever they are, using these apps and listening to them. Whereas in reality, when you're working with a teacher or a clinician, as Kelly alluded to, there is this kind of back and forth. There is this adjustment of the practice based on what I know about the group. And there is nobody overseeing that process when it comes to the way that we think about these apps. So when you say, is it the Wild West? I think, yeah, it's basically as close as we can possibly get.
It's kind of worse than that in a way, isn't it, Nicholas? Because if you are told to use the app and it doesn't help you, then that reinforces your sense that you're a failure.
Yeah, and look, Kelly said that, right, which is, that she said people told her to try harder. And yeah, that's a problem both, and that problem does come to some extent from, I think there's two avenues from where that problem is coming. One is actually from some meditation spaces themselves, where actually some meditation teachers will actually view you as the problem and not the meditation. And I think that's totally problematic in terms of how the meditation approach is viewing things. And some of what we know about harmful experiences around mindfulness and meditation is from exactly that, where, a senior teacher who has an authority position is basically saying, you're just doing it wrong. You're supposed to go through difficult experiences, and that's part of the transformation and the journey, when in fact, we actually don't know that. There is no evidence to suggest that people have to go through difficult experiences to have beneficial outcomes. But you're right, it's even worse, I think, when you've got people that are being recommended or being told to try harder in the healthcare setting, or when they're being told, look, mindfulness apps are wonderful and helpful, and it's puppies and kittens and little children, you know, in lotus positions, and it's fluffy clouds, and, you know, how could it possibly do anything wrong? And so there's kind of like, there's like gaslighting going on, where basically people are being told, well, this works for everyone. You know, if it doesn't work for you, it's got to be you. You know, it can't possibly be that it's what we're telling you to do, it doesn't work. It's got to be that you're doing something wrong. You're not trying hard enough. You're not doing the instructions right. And so I think people are then looking inside and going, okay, well, what am I doing? You know, am I not meditating hard enough? Am I not, you know, what am I, you know, how do I double down? How do I try harder? And I think that then compounds the situation and makes it even worse.
Like gambling, you're not winning because you're not gambling properly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just go around a little bit, and in the interests of provoking discussion rather than promoting something that I actually believe, it's a bit like religion, isn't it? We don't register, you don't have to register or prove that a belief system works to be a church in Australia. Anyone, you know, Cardinal Nicholas Van Dam, you can set up a church and even get tax deductible status and all the, you know, bells and whistles that come with it by ticking the right boxes and establishing a religion. We don't stop people from doing that. We trust that the communal ideas marketplace will filter out the charlatans. In fact, it doesn't. Not entirely, but to some degree it does. Why should mindfulness apps be any different?
Because they're not well, even though they purport to come from Buddhist practice, they're not religion. They're therapeutic goods, or being at least marketed as therapeutic goods. The point of religion is to reconnect you with the ultimate, with goodness, with truth and beauty, whereas these are promoted as they're going to make you less unwell.
Pretty fine line, don't you think, Kelly?
I agree with Kelly. I think that this is a huge element of the problem, is that there is this conflation of mental health and mental illness and wellness or spirituality. And I think what the kind of complex maneuvering that these organizations and companies, many not-for-profits and many well-intentioned, but what they're often doing is they're pitching you on the mental health crisis, which is very real. They're saying there's a huge crisis, we don't have people to support it. But then there's this pivot to, oh, but what we do is we promote well-being, wellness, flourishing, spiritual connection. And it's in that kind of pivot where things get really tricky, right? Because I think, as you rightfully say, John, you know, when we're talking about well-being, when we're talking about spirituality, when we're talking about flourishing, what does that look like? How do we measure, you know, how do we measure it? How do we regulate what flourishing looks like within individuals? That's a challenge. But when we're talking about health-related outcomes, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about physical health, we're talking about education in schools, you know, we're talking about programs that governments are supporting and paying for, that taxpayer dollars are paying for. That, to me, is where we have a huge problem. You know, it's when you're basically saying, we're not just saying this is something that can make you feel better, this is something that can actually address illness. That's where you really, to my mind, cross a huge line, and you start to get into the space of promoting something that you're implying it is a therapeutic good, and it's not regulated as a therapeutic good.
Okay, we're stealing Jeannie's thunder as we go down this path of the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So I'll kind of park that if I can. And Kelly, we'll get back to your point as well. I do, though, just want to interrupt Nicholas to read a really lovely tribute to you, Kelly, which has come in on the Q&A. So on the Q&A, I'm sure people are familiar now with Zooms, but just in case someone isn't, if you move your cursor down to the bottom, there's a Q&A logo at the bottom, and you can ask us a question and we will get to them, and there's a chance for your questions to be fed into the participants a little later after we've heard a bit more from Nicholas and then from Jeannie. But Sam pays tribute to you, Kelly. I want to express my gratitude to Kelly for being so authentic, genuine, raw and impactful in sharing her story. Really hit it in my feelings. I thought it would be a discussion of logical evidence or findings this seminar, but yeah, thanks, Kelly. You made the discussion more impactful with connection to a real lived experience. So there you are. I just thought I'd throw that one in. And Nicholas, just while we're going through, before we get to the Therapeutic Goods Administration part of it in more detail, from a clinician or practitioner point of view, it must be almost, as Kelly was saying, it's irresistible to increase your throughput, the number of people you think you're helping by saying, I think this is the best app for you. And, we could spend hours, but you can do this on your own at home. What do you do to try and, I don't know, triage the people for whom that is appropriate and the people for whom it isn't?
I mean, I think exactly what you said in the question, which is triage. I think one of the things we do terribly in the mental health system is triage. So we effectively have no way of differentiating between the people who need more intensive approaches from those who need less intensive approaches. And so the system, I think, actually is not set up to triage. So currently we rely way too much on overburdened GPs and school teachers to be doing all of the work. And I mean, I think I would question sort of even the way that we approach this in the stepped care system. With stepped care, the idea is that everybody starts at the lowest level and they progress to more intensive services once they've failed at lower level services. And various people, including Pat McGorry and others, have proposed that what we actually need is something other than that, a staged care model. And the idea of that essentially is that if you present with an incredibly severe presentation at the outset, you should skip the early stages. We shouldn't be handing you an app. You should be going straight to a psychiatrist or psychologist or inpatient treatment. And that's just logical. And so I think, as you said, there is a real temptation, though, because what we're doing, so I think, first of all, we need that reform. We need to get better at triaging and identifying who needs what. But I think until we have that conversation, the problem will continue to be that educators and GPs and frontline providers are being asked to deal with everyone. And it is tempting, I think, when the arguments that are often being made by various companies, various app providers, online programs, are basically saying, we have a universal one-size-fits-all program that is going to help everyone. And so I think the idea from a lot of providers, clinicians, educators is, well, what's the worst it could do? Like, at least it won't harm anyone. What we've obviously heard from Kelly is that's not true. And we know that from the data as well. The data suggests that that's absolutely not true. But that's the common attitude is, well, it won't hurt anyone. And so this idea is, well, you may not love it, you may not like it, but it's something you can do while you're waiting to get an appointment, with the next provider. And I think the reality is that just makes the whole scenario worse. So I think we have to dive into both the idea of how are we actually assessing people at the front lines and who are we expecting to do that? And then also when we're thinking about who do we actually give these things to, we have to actually be much more clear about what evidence we have for them. And the reality is we have very little. I think we need so much more evidence before we start pushing these things out into the real world and before we start telling people that these will solve their problems. And we haven't seen that. We don't have that evidence.
So I'm the Minister for Health, and I've just appointed you, Nicholas Van Dam, as the Director of Mental Health in whichever state you'd care to name. And I've said to you, don't expect more money, but you have to meet this mental health crisis as best you can. Why don't you use more technology? It'll save enormous amounts of time and money. How do you deal with that? Because that's where the pressure's coming from, isn't it? From above, from people saying, we haven't got more money, but you can do more with technology.
Look, it's actually a really great question, and luckily it's something I've thought about. I think the solution sort of to that is
but you thought about becoming the Director of Mental Health Services.
No, I really don't want that job, and I really appreciate the person who's doing it. I'm sure that they're not being appreciated enough, and they're probably not being paid enough. It is a very difficult job that I want nothing to do with. But whoever that minister is should feel free to give me a call if they want my advice. But frankly, what I would say is that that is the situation, right? And I do understand it in the sense that, we're not prepared to necessarily, and I should say by we, I actually don't mean me, I mean the government is not necessarily prepared to put more money into the spaces it needs to. It absolutely does, and that would be my first advice, would be go back to your budget people and reconsider where our money is going. Because if you don't invest in this, what are we investing in and why are we doing it? I think if we don't start thinking about what's going on, particularly with young people, thinking about the future, I mean, I'm worried. You know, the reality sort of is we're investing in all kinds of other things like military services. You know, we're spending a lot of money there. What if we took a little bit of that money and put it in mental health? But leaving that aside,
or football stadiums, for instance. Yeah,
sure, exactly. Do we need more football stadiums when we don't have enough clinicians to deal with people's mental illness? You know, so you know you're experiencing sort of severe depression, but hey, go and watch a footy game.
Although there will be people who say that's the best thing for my mental well-being is going to the footy and being involved in that world and letting off steam.
And I don't look. I don't have any.
Helpful.
What's that?
Because religion is helpful. Like footy's as much a religion as Christianity or Buddhism or.
Sure. And I think that's another whole forum for another day. Keep going, Nicholas.
Well, my position on that sort of is, look, when it comes to what you're recommending to individuals, it's up to the individual, right? So for individual people, of course, you know, there are things that you can choose that help you, that may be going to footy, that may be religion, that may be other things. That is your call as an individual. If it works for you, great. But when it comes to policy, we have to rely on evidence, right? And so what I think, look, what happens here, I think, is that so more money is not going to be introduced. So what do? You know, there is this huge pull to use more technology. I think a really smart thing that has been discussed a lot, and I think we're talking around this in circles in the mental health space, is there are actually a lot of people out there who are untapped resources with respect to dealing with acute crises in mental health and just stressors. So we've got clinicians, spiritual care workers, we've got chaplains, we've got other people, you know, that are working in this space. We've got meditation teachers who could be pulled in to some extent to help with the initial distress of day-to-day life. Now, I'm not saying that those people should be providing for people with serious mental illness, but it is a whole other source of resources and a whole other set of individuals who are very eager to help. And I think when we're talking about the stress of day-to-day life, when we're talking about sort of existential stress and distress, some of those people are arguably much better equipped to deal with these issues than a psychologist or a psychiatrist would be. So when I talk about that staged care, I'm thinking the staged model needs to go even further. You know, when people come and present and say, I'm actually experiencing, you know, existential unease, well, is that someone that actually needs to go and see a psychologist for 20 sessions? I mean, maybe what they need to do is go and seek counsel from whoever the appropriate spiritual counselor is, right? Or whoever else is. So there's heaps of other people that are ready and willing and eager to help on this space. And so that would be my answer, is that the solution is not just more technology. I think the solution is actually that there are more people that are out there that are prepared to help.
Okay, and just before we go to Jeannie, who I'm sure impatiently is sitting there going, oh my God, I don't want to jump in here, just about technology, about which she's also an expert. But Nicholas, the buzz at the moment is all about, you know, AI, machine learning and complex learning systems that learn how to learn. And ChatGPT is a brand name, but that's an example of it, where you can ask it a question, it'll spit out an answer based on the entire internet, which it can scour in the blink of an eye. Do you think maybe the sort of apps we're talking about today will soon be redundant, and in fact we'll have a next generation set of apps that might be able to solve some of these problems? Or are you just as skeptical about future technology as you are about current technology?
I think I am skeptical, and I think part of that has to do with there's two factors. One is there's a fundamental trust that what is out there in the internet is good, which, you know, I have my concerns about what is out there. I mean, these models are often training on the whole of the internet, and they're non-discriminating. They're just basically training on, you know, everything they can get their hands on. And so, I mean, they may get more refined and they may get more specific. And if there is a way to feed feedback or give feedback to them in the way that they learn, which I'm sure Jeannie can say a lot more about this than I can, those could get better. But at the end of the day, I don't know that any of those things can fundamentally address the issue when people need to work with another person. And I think, you know, there's some data increasingly coming out. Willoughby Britton's group at Brown University has found that one of the biggest drivers of benefits in mindfulness-based groups is actually the group element, right? So just being with other people. So fundamental to the benefits of sort of learning how to do meditation and mindfulness practices is being able to talk to other people about what happens to you as you're having those experiences, and to get that feedback and that reassurance. You can't do that with technology.
Well, we're doing it with technology now, you could argue, couldn't you?
Well, but we're talking to each other. There's an element of synchronicity while we're all conversing at the same time. So that is fine. I mean, there's this element of technology as a platform to facilitate interaction with other humans, versus
rather than
technology as a replacement for interaction with humans. And I think the idea of technology as a vessel or a platform by which we connect with others, that's wonderful. Like, you know, when people sort of can't get to people, it's a great way of actually providing that opportunity. I think what we can't do is we can't remove people from the equation entirely.
I better move on, but we will come back to both you and Kelly, of course. But Jeannie Patterson has been waving her arms and wanting to jump in on so many occasions. I feel absolutely shamed that I've not been able to get to her a little earlier and on time. And Jeannie, what do you make of the dilemmas that both Nicholas and Kelly have so carefully and thoroughly explained?
Well, I've actually been cheering them on because I think their insights have been so profound and useful, Jon. So thank you, Kelly, for sharing your story. I think it's so important to hear from you and people with your experiences. And thank you, Nick, for bringing your absolute expert insight to this area and also emphasising, you know, the value of humans in this story. So, Jon, really, I'd agree with both of our speakers that we've got an unregulated product, in your words, the Wild West on the market, and we're not really thinking about whether these products are addressing the mental health crisis that we're facing. It's kind of like a techno-solutionism. Now, I could talk to you. I've been looking at these papers, these apps with my good colleague. I just want to give her a call out, Sweethamino Anil Thal Padmanabhan, who's done a lot of the work with me in looking at the consumer protection issues about these apps. And if I may, I'd like to talk about, you raised the question, are we going to see chatbots providing mental health services? Well, we already are. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the apps. I'd like to talk about some of the consumer protection harms, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about the regulation, because that seems to be what we've all been talking about. So I know that you will jump in at any moment, but I'll start just with a little picture about the apps. So there's a variety of mental health apps on the market, and the ones that are of interest to me as a consumer protection scholar, are apps that are providing an automated service direct to the consumer. So they're not mediated by a mental health professional. A mental health professional might refer them, but they're a direct to consumer product. So their service is automated. It is not involving a mental health professional. And there's different kinds of apps that are available. There's meditation and mindfulness apps that the consumer enters a whole lot of information and gets some personalised recommendations. I'll say a bit more about that because Kelly has really raised concerns about just how personalised those are. There's mood charting apps that allow users to enter personal information and then chart their moods and their feelings day to day, and then provides advice about how they might improve their overall moods. And then finally, there's actually conversational chatbots that are providing cognitive behavioural therapy. Now, those chatbots are not ChatGPT. They're not using the whole of the internet to provide advice for good reason. They've been trained in a similar way, but they're kind of ring-fenced so that they only provide answers that have been vetted by the provider and often based on therapeutic notes. Another issue that I'll come to. So that's the sort of spectrum of apps we're seeing in the market. And then it's sort of at the far end, we're seeing things like Replica, which are fully automated human companions combating loneliness. I'm going to almost leave that one out because it's so ridiculous and appalling. So we've got these products on the market, the automated products being presented to consumers, and they might be useful. But from the perspective of the consumers, we've seen there's some real concerns because the consumer may have it recommended by a healthcare provider, or they might find it themselves on the internet, on an app store, or by going and looking at a guide about the best mental health apps available on the market. And what we find is that those apps may or may not be verified in terms of what we would normally regard as rigorous scientific studies. The fact that cognitive behavioural therapy works in a one-on-one situation simply doesn't mean it works when it's provided through a chatbot. The fact that mindfulness training may make some people feel better or improve their appreciation of life or of a jelly bean doesn't mean that's going to work through an automated service. And it also doesn't mean it's going to work with, as Kelly noted, people with complex mental health conditions or people who are outside the norm of whom that app has been trained on. So people perhaps who are neurodiverse, or people with complex trauma, and so on. But the apps, this is my concern, are marketed exactly like any other consumer product online. Like, we're kind of familiar with kind of this aggressive marketing that comes with, I don't know, gym memberships, bank loans, or cryptocurrencies. The same processes, the same marketing processes are used for mental health and wellbeing apps. And cryptocurrency is, right, a really good comparator here, because there's a lot of hype, but not necessarily a lot of good stuff behind the glossy pictures of smiling clouds or galloping ponies. So let's have a look at that, if I may. First concern is these apps gobble up data. That's what they're doing. They're taking in personal sensitive information in to provide the service, but in many cases, we don't know what's happening with that information. And I'd refer our listeners to the recent Mozilla ranking of mental health apps, which found most of them were lacking in their data privacy protections, and also their cybersecurity protections. So the data's been collected, processed, and then in many cases turned back on the consumer in the terms of targeted advertising or various types of profiling, which aren't necessarily being used to improve the mental health of the consumer.
That's designed to improve the commercial success of the app.
Exactly. Simply the way we see in targeted marketing. We gather data, find out more about you so we can shoot right back at you the kind of ads that will keep you involved and paying money to be signed up to the apps, which is not necessarily conducive to best mental health or wellbeing outcomes, quite frankly. But it goes further, because in many cases, those apps are provided through an employer or a university. And so that information, albeit aggregated, is often provided to the employer or the university who's supporting the app. Now, what we know about aggregated information is that aggregated information is aggregated, but it doesn't mean that particular individuals' experience of mental health can't be found out from that information, particularly if it's
de-identified from a massive data. Yep.
Correct. De-identified or just ascertained if you're in a small workplace, which I think people may not be pleased to know about. It goes further. Most of the apps promote their outcomes with very little necessary science behind it, but users that perhaps have a free trial or go to unsubscribe often find that they're nagged by the app to come back on board. So that I know students at one point were offered a free subscription with a particular app. That subscription is something we call a dark pattern, which is a way of tricking consumers into outcomes that perhaps aren't in their best interests. And what it does, some examples of that is when the consumer's signing up, they're asked a whole lot of questions about their health conditions. That is quite sensitive and important information. But once that information is provided, the app then has a basis to nag the consumer to sign up to get a solution for that health condition. The information's been shared, it's out of the bag, and the app can use it to nag the consumer to in fact pay money to sign up for the product that the app is offering, regardless of whether the consumer has decided it's useful for them or not. Often, a free trial requires people to put a credit card in, which means they're signed up. And then the subscription process involves what are called dark patterns or subscription traps. It's really hard to unsubscribe. Now, these are all things that have been criticised, as I said, with gym memberships or, signing up to journals online. But this is a mental health product, and yet the worst excesses of consumer protection are going to be applied to them. And that's not even going to the ethical conditions that Nicholas and Kelly have raised about whether this is even right to be promoting online therapy to people that may be exhibiting quite profound mental health crises in quite unsupervised environments. So we may ask, and I know the people online are asking, why aren't we regulating these apps? Well, part of the answer, I think, is that we as a society and possibly the regulators have swallowed the Kool-Aid that we've just talked about, which is we have a mental health crisis, and technology must be able to provide a solution. Instead, we should be investigating these products and viewing with the skepticism that we view any new product that's being advertised online, whether it be buy now, pay later, or cryptocurrency or wallets or the like. The product should be scrutinised by regulators. And moreover, I think this answer requires a combination of regulators. We've mentioned the TGA, but we also should be talking about the ACCC, which is the Consumer Protection Regulator in Australia. And we should be talking about the health profession as well, who should be educating themselves about these products so they actually understand how they work and what the harms are.
But there's always a lag. I'll come to you, Kelly. There's always a lag between new technology and the regulation of it. You know, I'm fond of saying that when Herr Daimler and Herr Benz combined the internal combustion engine with a horse and cart and made a self-propelling vehicle 120 years ago, it took at least 10 or 15 years in most countries for road rules, licensing, insurance, registration, and all the rest of it to come. You know, people had to walk with a flag in front of the car when they were first invented. So we're kind of at that stage with a lot of this, aren't we? We're just finding our way, and there's a lag.
No, that's a cop-out. I'm so sorry. That is such a cop-out. We have this thing called the law, and guess what? Technology is subject to the law. In any other context, sending out an ad that says, want to reduce stress, 10 minutes a day will reduce your stress by 80% without having a verified study that's applicable to the user group. In any other context, that would be misleading conduct, contrary to the Australian consumer law, which would be sanctioned. We don't need law that applies to mental health apps or chatbots or ChatGPT. We have law that applies. It's just not being applied.
I would also say that some of these things have been around. I mean, this idea that they're really new, I mean, some of these have been around for 2 decades. So, I mean, the fact that these are all over the place and everywhere is yes, that's relatively new, but some of these products have been on the market for a decade or two. So it's not like these just came out last week. So when we talk about ChatGPT and, you know, AI, some of the advances there are very recent. And so there's been lots of wonderful discussions happening around that, but we're not in that space here. I mean, we're talking about, you know, a decade and a half, if not more.
And also,
you can use that argument. I'll come to you, Jenny, and Kelly wants to speak too. But in fact, you can argue that the failure to do anything about the older generation of apps makes the failure to do something about the current generation even more glaring. You've created an environment where you've said, yeah, that's okay, which has encouraged the generation of new ones. I'll come back to you in a moment, Jenny, but Kelly's been waving to me a bit, and I am guilty as charged of not having got back to her before.
No, it's difficult to manage these kind of panels anyway when there's so many people wanting input. You're going okay. It's like the Therapeutic Goods Administration and Consumer Protection, but like you also need lived experiences, voices in that. You need to have people who have used the apps, who've maybe, like if you can find people who've been helped by the apps, but also people who've been harmed by them, in having a look at those regulations and the application of those regulations. Because you, like, with everything, if it's only the people who have a vested monetary interest in it doing the promoting and the trying to get it okayed, then you're not going to get the full story.
Sure, it's a sample bias, and you get the same with what's called algorithm bias now, don't you, Jenny? Where if the app is being used for people with particular things, then that reinforces the narrowness of its field. But this is your area of deep research. Take us through it.
So that's absolutely right, and you know. So first of all, I'm going to start with the TGA and then walk to this idea of AI accountability that both Kelly and Jon have raised. So I keep getting asked, well, why doesn't the TGA act on this product? Well, there's 2 things. One is that most of the apps aren't medical devices. So medical devices are devices that are used for diagnosis or treatment. A lot of the apps are simply health or lifestyle products, so they're not being caught. And I go back to the point that there's a disconnect between the way they're regulated and their headline promotions. The apps that are being used for diagnosis or to provide a health outcome are often justify themselves as staying between therapeutic guidelines. This is something that my good colleague Piers Gooding has been looking at. So again, that element of automation is not being scrutinised. As Nick said, if it works face-to-face, there's assumption that it works once it's automated. But we know that automation itself introduces a friction. We've seen that in all sorts of areas. I don't need to list them for us. The act of automating what was previously a human process introduced all sorts of potential harms because of the very process of automation. That might be algorithmic bias, where the app is trained on particular, if it's an AI app, particular kinds of data, so is skewed towards what it's been trained on. But it also may involve what we call the problem of thin or missing data. This is where certain groups have not even been included in the training of the app. And I think Kelly's comments are very, very appropriate here. If you look at the boards of the people who are developing mental health apps, the app may reflect their lived experience, but it may not reflect the lived experience of the sort of people that are being recommended to use the app.
So Nicholas,
automation is a problem. Sorry.
Nicholas, effectively then what Jeannie's saying is that if a human therapist says a sentence of words, but a machine says exactly the same words at the same step in the process of helping people in a therapeutic environment, the outcome can be different. Is that right?
I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, there's, I don't know the research, but I mean, from this perspective, sort of, I don't know that you could argue that a machine would say the same thing as a therapist at the same stage. I think the reality sort of is that a whole element of how the therapist works with the client is that they're adapting what they're doing based on their training, and which is in theory evidence-based, but also based on adapting to what's going on in the room with the client. And unless we have some really amazing, sophisticated programming that I don't know about, that's not what's happening with these programs. But if I could make one more comment as well, based on what Jeannie was saying, is that I think there's something really interesting in this idea that they're being promoted as lifestyle or wellness devices. I think there's this space that has been identified by these companies that is the sweet spot for them, which is that they get to talk about mental health and illness, but because they promote themselves as wellness devices, it's that thing that I said earlier, which is that when people want to make decisions for their own well-being or spiritual health or whatever, it's up to them, because that's hard for us to generate evidence for. That's not how science works, right? It's hard for us to ascertain empirically whether or not something promotes someone's spiritual growth. So the problem, I think, then sort of is we find ourselves in this sort of loophole whereby which I think our economic system loves, which is it's individual responsibility. It's up to you as an individual to figure out whether or not this works for your wellness. But then I think to what Jeannie is saying, but with the other hand, while with the right hand they're saying we're wellness, we're lifestyle, we're spirituality, with the other hand they're holding up, but you're stressed, but you're anxious, but you're depressed, but you can't sleep. And so what any reasonable person, I think, is left to conclude is, oh, well, the app must address all of the things that they're saying are concerns of mine, and it's my individual responsibility to figure out whether it can do it for me because it's a wellness app. And so that's the problem, I think, sort of, is that there's this giant loophole. It's the size of a city, and we're allowing this loophole to stay open.
I've just thought of an experiment which you can tell me immediately, Nicholas, may or may not work. What if you've got two ChatGPT machines speaking to each other rather than to a person? That would be interesting to see how they go figuring out the relationship between the two machines.
I suspect it would spiral in a very negative way very quickly.
Might be worth doing. Kelly, you've been waving your hand, and I'm sorry. Back to you.
No, you're okay. So two things. One on your question to exactly the same words, and then one on the idea of individual responsibility. So in mentalization-based therapy, there's a really strong emphasis on epistemic trust, on building epistemic trust. So the trust that my knowledge and my imparting of my knowledge is done with you in mind, and that it's for you. That's so, like, even me talking here, like, I don't know most of the people viewing this, right? Like, I don't. And so there's some level of epistemic trust, otherwise you probably would have tuned out, but like relatively minimal. You cannot build epistemic trust with with a chatbot or an algorithm or a recorded meditation, because you don't, like, there's not the give and take. There's no sense that they can see me. And then that then becomes problematic when, like, people who are struggling with just like activities of daily living, right? Like when you're struggling to cook yourself a meal or like brush your teeth, when like washing your hair for the most part consists in dry shampoo. Like, it's so common for people with depression, besides other less common, more complex mental health conditions. The idea that people who are struggling with that have to then work out, is this thing good for me? And the only way I can tell if it's going to be good for me is by exposing myself to the risk of it harming me, is wild, so wild. Like, is it good for me to drive heavy machinery? I don't know. I'm going to give it a go, even though I'm struggling to like make myself breakfast in the morning.
Yeah. Got it. Now, Karen has contributed saying it's not a question but an insight. Many people where I live in the Philippines here can't afford professional help and resort to free mental health apps because they're more accessible. And an anonymous attendee says there's also an element of guilt that prompts these, that is prompted from these apps. It perpetuates stress and pressure on the user, and that's not mentally beneficial, which is part of that sense of failure we had before. But Jenny, to throw this back at you, is it the cross-disciplinary nature of it that makes regulation so difficult? Because you said before, you want the ACCC to get involved. It's also the TGA. It's also the individual colleges of practitioners and presumably psychiatrists, and then the psychological registration boards in all the states, which makes it even more complex because some of these are federal and some of these are state and so on. How do you get some of those regulatory hurdles behind us? How do you get on the front foot? There's a question, can we be more interventionist instead of just reactive, proactive instead of reactive?
It's such a good question, because we like to think in terms of one fix for a particular solution. But in complex society, generally we need what Christine Parker would call networked regulation, where we recognise that the problems from complex products are complex, and so we need a number of regulatory responses. We need a network of regulatory responses, and we need to recognise perhaps the thing that is unique about technology is that there is a greater need for different regulatory agencies and different gatekeepers to work together, because we should also be talking about, you know, the app developers themselves need to be thinking about best practice for AI responsibility or ethics if they're going to take on that technology. How do we get all those organisations working together? Well, I think that actually the answer is found in what both Nicholas and Kelly have said. We need to cut through this nonsense that these are lifestyle products. They are holding themselves out as being something that can combat poor mental health. They are being sold on that basis. And if they're going to promote themselves on that basis, they need to be put to task to stand by those assertions and take the responsibilities that come with it. And all of those bodies I've mentioned, rather than waiting for something to go really, really wrong, need to be stepping forward and going, I'm not going to accept that just because it's technology, it's somehow benign. And I'm not going to accept that just because it's covered with the gloss of mindfulness or calmness, that it's not intervening in people's mental health. We know this in our society. We're only beginning to understand how important it is to take mental health seriously. This is an area where we really, really can showcase best efforts instead of kind of closing our eyes.
I'll come to you in a second, Nicholas, but I'm just wondering, Jeannie, and I'm inviting more questions too. We've specifically set time aside at this stage in our forum for your questions, so you can bombard us with them and I'll moderate them as much as I can while we're on the run. But I guess what you're leading to, Jeannie, is a class action on mindfulness. You want to put mindfulness in the box and test it in court and show if it doesn't stand up, give me back my money. Is that where you're heading?
That's not where I'm heading, though I don't mind that as an idea. I think that would strike fear into a lot of app providers and get them to step up to best practice. The problem with the class act, and I'm a lawyer, so of course I'm going to go, court. But actually, I'm a consumer protection lawyer, and we don't want cases to go to court because that takes years and years and years to get an outcome. What we want is what we in the law sometimes called ex ante regulation. If you have a cliff that people fall off, two responses. You can put an ambulance at the bottom, that's the class action, or you can put a fence at the top. That's standards to stop this stuff going wrong. I think the answer is actually standards. And if the standards aren't being, that we're expecting and should be demanding from these products aren't being recognised, that's exactly where we want the psychological profession to step in, the TGA, the ACCC, the health system to step in and say, hey, these are the baseline standards we accept if you're going to allow a product to hit the market. In Australia, we actually have very robust regulation of financial products. People will have heard that we've just decided that buy now, pay later, which has caused untold harm to people through its penalty fees, is going to be regulated as credit. The regulation of credit in Australia aims to ensure that the harm doesn't happen to the product, from the product. Now, there's no reason why we can't do that in this space as well.
So, Nicholas, in a moment, but just on that analogy that you've given, a lot of the time the fence only gets built after someone's sued and said, now I want compensation. And then they go, oh, we better build a fence. We better put up the protective barrier around the machine or whatever it might be, the ski lift and so on.
I think actually that's not necessarily so. I think actually what we see in Australia is a lot of proactive action. We haven't got a class action on buy now, pay later. We did have a class action on pelvic mesh, which was problematic. Think of scams. Think of our response to scams. We've just set up a scam centre to deal with this sort of idea of proactive regulation. So I take your point, John, that sometimes we need a class action to stimulate response. But I'd have to say, and I am an optimist, that I think in Australia, lobbying by people that care often produces proactive legal responses.
Nicholas?
Well, I mean, just on Jeannie's point, I mean, I think to draw the analogy further, I mean, I think people are already falling off the cliff as well. We know that, we have evidence of that. Kelly is certainly a case of one, right? But we've got lots of other examples. So I think people are falling off. So it's not like it's not happening and we're waiting to see. What I was going to say sort of pertains, I guess, both to this general conversation, but to Kelly's comment earlier around trust. Because I think one thing that's, I think, really important in thinking about these programs and how they're promoting themselves is that they often are promoting themselves to a certain extent on the credentials of either the founders or the people who develop the offerings that are contained within these guided meditation apps or guided mindfulness programs. And so you've got people basically resting on the laurels of, I was once a Buddhist monk, or, we have psychologists who helped to develop this, or so there is this sense of they're appealing to people's sense of trust. And, I was thinking about the way that we operate clinically, there is this sense of we have oaths that, we have the Hippocratic Oath, we have this sense of in medicine that there's an imperative to first do no harm. And so I think going back to Jeannie's point, there are particular standards to which we recognize that we all have to work and operate. And I think sort of this idea of, if you're going to appeal to the public saying, I am an authority figure in this space, there's a responsibility that goes along with it, by which you have to say, if you're an expert, demonstrate your credibility as an expert, and demonstrate that you have accountability and credibility for that expertise and the recommendations that you make. And if those apply to people's mental health or illness, then you ought to be responsible for that not working.
So Andrew Scully has written that there's about 150,000 new wellness apps in the Apple App Store every year. How do you disincentivize rogue app developers? Which sort of brings us back to the Wild West question, doesn't it? It's overwhelming, and the potential riches, if yours hits a vein or goes viral, if a pop star says, oh, this is the one that helped me, potential riches are just so tempting for people.
Well, Jon, sorry, Kelly, I'll let you go.
You're on mute, Kelly.
Thank you. My thought was just that having that research, and that we expect that research, and that I don't know if it's that the various colleges and professional bodies like endorse particular apps or market those, like the well-evidenced apps, to their members for particular issues. Like no one's marketing I don't know, Panadol for broken legs, right? But Panadol is marketed for pain. Maybe it's that the professional bodies insist on that, on the evidence, and that the app developers then become incentivized to show that they have good evidence and a targeted market.
Okay, Nicholas?
I think that this idea, because I think there's sort of two ways of managing the problem. One sort of is that there's the regulatory approach, and I'm by no means against that, but there's some challenges to getting that up and running. But the other side of things, I think we have to tackle a problem like this from all sides. The other side, though, is actually an incentivization method, whereby sort of you create a system whereby having the seal of approval from professional bodies, and or even kind of having the App Store kind of say, if you've ticked certain boxes and met certain standards, you've conducted research that demonstrates your product works. If you subject what you're doing to review by qualified professionals who can say your product actually has evidence of working and having good privacy protection policies, then their product could get promoted. And I think, given what we know about the market,
it's like the heart tick method in the supermarket for healthy foods.
Exactly. And so that's so to my mind, it's really hard to manage 150,000 new wellness apps. So, kind of going through them all and sort of saying, 145,000 of these are no good is really challenging. But the other side of things is saying, look, unless you subject your product to review and evaluation, to my mind, that's a workable model. Why wouldn't we expect people to go through a process of saying, demonstrate that you've done what you need to do, and that the right people are behind it, and that there is transparency in your product, and that it has the appropriate protections for consumers, and then we will promote it.
So you pay a fee to be assessed. That fee goes to pay the costs of the body that does the assessing. Not everybody who pays the fee and gets assessed gets the tick. Is that what you're suggesting, that sort of model?
I mean, I think that certainly leads to something that could be sustainable, but I also don't see, given the scenario that we find ourselves in, why, agencies and organizations that are already paying into this might not chip in to get it started, because I think in order to get something like this moving, you need more than, just the goodwill of these organizations, because these companies are already making heaps and heaps of money, in the current situation that we find ourselves in. So I think kind of going to them, head in hand and saying, please, please, please subject yourself to review. I don't know that that's going to work. I think, the health minister, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, there might be a bit of an onus on them to say, look, let's work together here and let's throw some money into the ring to actually start incentivizing people to do the right thing. And let's actually start doing some of the necessary research on what's going on here.
I'll come to you in a second. I just want to read out a text, which is, I think, a really interesting one from Chris Booth, who is the chaplaincy coordinator here at the University of Melbourne, where we're hosting this. Nicholas mentioned that chaplains and other spiritual carers might be able to offer opportunities to talk about existential questions. How would you suggest we make that offer? In a lot of spaces, I find people don't think they can talk to a chaplain because they're not religious. It's a really interesting one. I'll park that for the moment and come back to it. But Jeannie, you were jumping up and down, and I'm coming to you now.
I'm always jumping up and down, John. We're talking about consumer protection with such lovely colleagues. What I was going to say is I think Nicholas is exactly right. So we move the regulatory focus forward away from courts and rules to standards that can help people assess quality. I think that's the way to go. But I'm just going to put out there may be 14,000 apps on the App Store, but the ones that do the best, the ones that use what I would call predatory marketing practices, which should stop right now, and the ones that are purchased by employers. So the money in mental health and wellbeing apps is actually not in selling the product to individuals. It's selling the product to a company that wants to do something for the wellbeing of its employees, because then you're not reliant on individuals. And we also know that actually individual use of apps tends to drop off quite quickly, which is why we have subscription traps and nagging emails. So if employers are purchasing wellbeing mental health apps for their organisation, and we're talking about big employers, those employers should also be undertaking some of the steps that Nicholas is talking about, because we're individuals. It's very hard for individuals to verify the quality of the product. Companies should be doing that, because a company promoting an app to its employees, giving that app the stamp of its approval.
Aren't we? We're just talking about quality control, an external independent quality controller, aren't we? Isn't that what it boils down to, Nicholas?
Yeah. Do you know it's called the TGA, and it's also called product safety standards? I mean, we've got models for that. We actually have quality.
Sure, but there's a difference between safety and quality.
They're related.
I mean, the TGA aren't going to say this one's better than that one. This is 3-star, that's 2-star, that's 1-star. I mean, they'll say, yeah, that restaurant is an unsafe place to eat. We're going to shut it down. But they're not going to tell you whether it should have 2 hats or 3 hats on the Michelin rating or whatever it is.
No, but we have this thing called Australian safety standards that are stamped on the back of bike helmets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why we have licensing for financial service providers. Well, we're talking about a similar mechanism. So whether it's provided by an independent body or by a government body, that model, Nicholas is entirely right, that model is used elsewhere, and we should be expecting it to be used here. But if we're talking about who has the clout to be demanding that, it's not individuals, particularly individuals with mental health complex mental health issues. It's actually employers that are promoting the apps, and psychologists or psychiatrists that are also using the apps in their therapeutic practices.
I would agree. And interestingly, I think in the US and in the market there, there were a couple of predominant sort of mindfulness meditation apps that were initially pushing for FDA approval, which is the equivalent of the TGA. So they were pushing for approval as a therapeutic good for things like mental health issues. But as far as I understand, they've started to actually pull back on that with a recognition that it would be incredibly difficult to get that approval. And so a big target seems to be around employee assistance programs. And so, as Jeannie is saying, essentially, where a lot of the money is coming from is by selling subscriptions to large organizations. And and to go further, a lot of the income is selling data. So, it's not individual subscriptions here. And I think Jeannie's absolutely right that, when a large organization or company is going to encourage their employees and even sign them up to use these things, they ought to be looking at, hey, what do we know about this? Is it actually working? And, they ought to be asking these questions.
There are a number of employers in Australia who have research facilities that are relevant that sign people up for these apps. And at the very least, they should be doing that work.
I mean, you kind of you're heading on a trajectory towards occupational health and safety rules we're talking about the workplace, if the employer says, I'm going to provide this app as a way of meeting my obligations for reducing stress in the workplace, then occupational health and safety rules cut in too, don't they, Jeannie? In which case you can say, well, hang on, it doesn't actually comply because it doesn't deliver, because it doesn't do anything. It's absolutely rubbish, and you're not meeting your obligations. And you could sort of do something perhaps there as well.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. I think that to the extent that employers are being asked to take mental health seriously in their workplaces, both for ethical and indeed, legal grounds, these sorts of questions should be asked. There's no safety for employers in providing an app that may not work. That's your quality point, or be positively harmful. That's Kelly's point.
So I'll anticipate the questions coming in. They haven't yet, but I'll cut them off at the pass. The bloody lawyers are spoiling everything for everybody. Kelly's waving, but I'll read Sian's contribution. The funders for the regulatory regime could require evidence to support that the apps are actually beneficial. App development costs millions, but that's why people do it. They invest because they're expecting or hoping for a return. And Craig says, this sounds like the panelists are calling for mindfulness apps to be regulated as therapeutic products, putting them into a class similar to the recently introduced software as medical device category. Therapeutics are regulated, food isn't, at least not in that way. Where do the panelists see this line when it comes to mindfulness products and services, which is kind of what we've been talking about, but Craig's putting it in very kind of specific terms. Look, our time is nearly up. We've promised people we'll finish before 3 o'clock, and we've only got about 6 or 7 minutes to go. So I just want to invite each of you to give us a kind of concluding remark and try and wrap all of this together and put a ribbon around it so that we've arrived somewhere where people who have joined us, and they've been remarkably generous in providing us with nudges in one direction or another. And I'll kind of go in reverse order. So, Jeannie, if I can go with you first, what's your step-by-step solution to, you've already said you want to see more regulation and the like, but where does it start? If it's cross-government, federal and state, if it's cross-disciplinary from ACCC and TGA and different colleges and the like, who takes the lead? Everyone's waiting for someone else to say, okay, this is my job.
Who takes the lead? Well, I think that actually those who maybe are working in the tech industry might like to take the lead. We've got so much hype, which is what you began with, around ChatGPT and large language models. These are the next generation of online app therapists. Let's have a real conversation about what it means to be human and what is valuable in human conversation and human interaction, and think critically about how we can use technology to make those interactions more impactful instead of just dropping an app down to solve what is a complex human problem.
You've got a public sector, private sector tension in this as well, of course.
Well, we've solved those. We've solved public sector, private sector tensions before. And at the moment, I think in the development of technology, everybody's acting in the shadow of what's coming next. Is it Armageddon, if you believe Elon Musk, or is it robust regulation, if you look at Europe? I would have thought this is a perfect time to have a really good conversation about the role we want this technology to play in our lives. It can be useful, but we need to make it human-centred as opposed to replacing the humans and ignoring the real lived experiences of the people who are impacted by it, as Kelly has shared with us.
Nicholas?
Yeah, I think Jeannie's spot on in many ways. We also, in addition to the tech industry, I'd really like to see particularly the government sectors that are sponsoring these programs and the corporations that are sponsoring these programs step up. I think in particular, if you are a Department of Health or a Department of Education, or if you are a major company sort of offering this to all of your employees, or if you're a university offering this to your students, I think you really have an obligation to actually spend a bit of time and money and resources looking at what's going on with these products and whether or not they're doing as they advertise. you know, because it's all well and good sort of to put mindfulness in schools, you know, if they're doing as they say. But if you're Department of Education and you're funneling money into these problems, and you're funneling money at private companies, why not require them to provide you with some evidence that they're doing as described? I mean, I think as a parent of a small child, my son's 7, you know, that's one of my greatest fears, is that someone's going to force him to learn some version of mindfulness and he's going to come home crying. And I think I think there's a responsibility from Department of Ed and Department of Health to step in. I also think there's responsibility within other professions in the mental health field, as we talked about, to say, look, we'd like to see more oversight. And I think there's a sense of we can offer an incentivization model whereby you can say, look, we can actually help you to promote your product if you will agree to work with us. And I think the power then is in the groups, in the organizations, as Jeannie so rightfully said. If we make this an individual problem, it's too hard to resolve. If we actually make this a societal issue, we can address this, because we have with so many other things. So really, I think the shift is to talk about it as a societal problem, not as an individual problem.
I'm just thinking I might be able to make my fortune by coming up with an AI model that assesses these 150,000 mindfulness apps. And if you pay me a fee, I'll let you know which of the 150,000 my app recommends.
Jon, that's called Choice Magazine, actually.
Which brings us, Kelly, back to you. Nothing about us without us, your lived experience. What do you make of where we found ourselves then, just to put a ribbon around this?
So I think I would push nothing about us without us a little bit further and just say nothing without us. There's a temptation to be like, well, the development of the app isn't really about the consumer yet, or the regulation isn't really about the consumer yet. It's only really the user experience or the what's on the screen that is really about the consumer, and that's where we will involve them. But if you involve people at every step of the development and the delivery and the evaluation of a product, you will end up with a better product. You'll also end up with better outcomes, because they will be the outcomes that people who will use that app want. But more than anything, we need to come back to what is the human person? What is that? And then what promotes flourishing? What promotes social, emotional, spiritual flourishing? And what do we do when that flourishing goes in the opposite direction? How do we treat people like,
yeah, absolutely.
How do we treat people like people?
Yep. Kelly, Jeannie, Nicholas in particular, for hosting it from the Centre for Contemplative Studies. It's been absolutely wonderful, and we've all learned a lot. And as I think we all agree also, we're not at the end, we're at the start of a process here. And where it ends, well, our contributions today help us work out exactly where we need to go. Whether we can make sure we do get there, well, that's that other awkward machine that we grapple with. That's called democracy. So we'll see how that works too. Thank you each very much to all the people who contributed with questions and joined in for the duration. It's been fabulous, and thank you all very, very much. I'll let you go and walk the dog or whatever it is that's your version of mindfulness from here.
Bye, one.